we've got a relationship with FENG going back, I guess 16, 17 years at least.
Yeah, maybe closer to 20.
Closer to 20, and spoken to the group many, many times. So I thought in the interest of the timing of this one, we would focus on the election impacts, not the politics of it, because I think we probably all had enough of that. And we're a neutral organization anyway, but more focused on, okay, where do we go from here? And so let me just get into this. We'll take a little bit different approach here. Let me see if I can get this. There we go. So I would say this conversation this morning is going to be more CI driven versus AI driven. That is collective intelligence of this group rather than AI. By the way, if you had plugged the title of this presentation into AI, it would have given you this presentation, but it would also have been a very generic presentation. So just try it sometime. You go to your chat CBT or whoever you're using, Baird, whoever you use, plug in the title of this presentation and see what comes up. It's kind of interesting. So it's all generic. And I think that's why, particularly now, we want to have this conversation that really is based in reality and what will impact each one of you individually, since each one of you has a different business or a different desire and goal as you're going into 2025. So Joyce, let me stop there. Sound check. Is this okay? The volume okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So our agenda is pretty simple. I want to look at the key impacts coming out of the election, and then talk about your perspectives, and then what we might do with those perspectives, and then launch off into the first 100 days for 2025. As Joyce just mentioned, simply raise your hand when you're ready to talk, and we're going to be doing a lot of this, so get that hand ready as we go through this presentation. I'm going to keep this very concise too and moving fast because I want to get to your input. As Don and David mentioned, Executive Next Practice has been around for 20 years. We've had north of 80,000 people come through our sessions. Most of those pictures you see there are based at UCIBL Applied Innovation, which is our home, and it's been a great partnership with them for over 10 years. This is where a lot of our information comes from, and it's sourced directly from our CEOs, CFOs, CMOs, the whole C-suite that attends these sessions. And as Don and Dave know from having many of these, we really tap this collective intelligence of the entire community to see what's going on versus research. The makeup of the group, again, just so you know the source of some of this, the demographics looks like this in terms of revenue size. If you come to the sessions, you'll see the smaller firms, startups, as well as some of the small caps. A majority are mid caps. I'd call it an Orange County mid cap in the $100 million range. And then the big players over $1 billion. And by design, we mix them up by function and by industry domain so that we can look at where the opportunities are coming from. You'll recognize some of our attendees. You're going to see the big players like the Edwards and Nestle's of the world. And you'll see some mid caps like Altura and a few others there that are up and coming. So again, I invite you to come to this. So I have thrown in a blatant commercial. I want to do it early so that you can get this on your radar. Our next afternoon session. This is the afternoon of February 27th. That's a Thursday afternoon at UCIBL Applied Innovation, followed by a strategic networking reception. So really encourage you to get in on this. This is how you can reach it there. There's the QR code. Joyce, I know I'm going to be sending you this deck. It'll have it, but if you point your camera at that or just go to our website, you'll see the developing session. Dean Ian Williamson will be our keynote. He'll open up the session along with approximately 20 CEOs from different industry domains that will do this reInvent Summit for us on the 27th. So I look forward to seeing you in person at that event. So let's get into the meat of this. 2025, on the basis of the recent election, we've kind of segmented it in two arenas where we'll see some major changes. We anticipate major changes. So these big five, and they're probably a big seven, but I had to force it down to this big five that we can talk about this morning and from a personal and from a business standpoint. So two ways to look at this as you're sharing your perspectives on these arenas. One is, what do you see as the potential impact on business in general? your business or others, the potential impact. And then second, what's the impact on employment and employees? And when you say employees, that could be you. What do you see as impact in terms of employment opportunities, the employment equation overall? So those are two perspectives I'd like you to talk about this morning. When we look at inflation, for example, here we're at 2.4. Tomorrow we'll see the revised number, the updated number. If you look at this chart since 2000, when you think about it, this is a pretty incredible picture. You saw a lot of twos and sub twos there. We've benefited for decades now from a fairly cush environment with some notable exceptions. If you stack this up against any other economy across the world, you won't see a parallel at all. My good friend Bill Edwards and I looked at this chart last night. I think most of you know Bill. And he said, yeah, this is exactly right. There is no other country in the world that has exhibited this kind of stability for such a long period of time. So now we're at 2.4 coming down, of course, off of a fairly difficult environment. So what are the expectations for 2025? I mean, how much further can you go from here? And then what would be, say, an impact if, based on what we've heard, that we go to a tariff-based arrangement? So let's start with the first one. Just as a number, what do you most of you expect for 2025 in terms of the inflation number? So as we look into, we're looking at June of 2025, what would be your number if you had to pick one?
Are you looking for a verbal response here, Scott?
Yeah, verbal response, please.
Yeah, I'd say 2.3 to 2.5.
I'd say 4 to 4.5.
Going back up? Good.
Yep.
3.5.
3.5. Okay, Bill, thanks. Others?
Yeah, the tariffs will cause it to go back up.
The offset will be the liberating of the energy sector that flows through everything in the supply chain. When the price of fuel goes down, that's a mitigating. If you want to understand why we have inflation, track the price of fuel from January 21 to where it is now, what the spikes have been, and that recognize 50% of a barrel of an oil goes into energy, 50% of it goes into other products such as fertilizer, plastics, etc.
Yeah, but that depends on the war too. So I guess there's other factors then.
Which war?
The Middle East.
It's done.
So I
That's
think,
done.
Scott,
That's over.
What I see in my industry, in the consumer product and goods industry, we import a lot from overseas and Asia. So our particular business, just talking about our particular business, will be hit big time with the tariffs.
You got headphones?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We'll
Can
be
I
hit
ask from
big
what?
time with tariffs.
From where do you, John? Where are you importing from?
Asia, China.
Because they've left tariffs in place. This administration has left tariffs in place with China. So I'm not sure what the increase is going to be.
Trump's promising a 60% tariff increase.
Yeah, but there's stuff already in place. So that's a negotiating ploy.
That's a good point. We deliberately put tariffs on here because obviously that's been the topic of conversation for so many months now. But to your point, Dave, the energy makes up such a large portion of this. Of course, housing's in there, but housing's we've seen the big impact from that since 2020, with housing doubling since 2020, the average price of housing. Other things that you expect for 2025, again, coming from we're at 2.4 now. What else do you see that's going to potentially impact inflation, one way or the other? Ideas?
Government spending.
From up, down, what would you say would be the impact?
Well, I would say that if Donald Trump is able to cut government spending, then you're going to see a negative impact on inflation.
Others? It's a good point. There's been a lot of discussion about doing some right sizing and efficiencies and productivity development.
The other piece will be the Fed.
Mhm.
There's, they just dropped interest rates another 25 basis points. I suspect they're going to hold the line for now until they, it's more of a mitigating. So I'm expecting them to be more hard-nosed in terms of trying to continuing to dampen inflation from an interest rate perspective.
Why are long-term rates then going up?
Because we've had an inverted yield curve for 2 years.
No, I think it's because people, at least the traders, are concerned about inflation.
That's a good point as well. Well, let's look at it from an employment standpoint. If you take it based on what you're talking about from an inflationary standpoint, what's it going to do from an employment standpoint?
Some people feel that because of deportations that you'll have some type of inflationary impact.
That's true. We're going to talk about immigration, drill into it in just a minute, but that's certainly a potential.
I know in California, we dodged a bullet with Prop 32 and the minimum wage increase. So instead of going to 18, it's only going up to $16.50. But you've seen the impact of the $20 on the fast food industry, right? And the affordability, and there's not been any employment in there. So I think locally, minimum wage is kind of a job dampener here, more pronounced than other places.
Yeah, the restaurant domain is certainly feeling the impact, and from talking with the restaurant groups, particularly in California, again, there's only so far they can go with things like automation, and you've seen some washouts already of certain chains that were already marginally performing. So we expect to see some more of those major chains step back, at least in California.
Anything from a productivity standpoint that could impact inflation positively?
I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Don't know. I mean, everyone talks about AI.
Yeah, I did want. Let's put that on the side for just a minute. I'm going to speak to productivity and AI in just a minute. But again, all of these are potentially could move into it. So if we look at the numbers, and again, thanks for the feedback on the inflation. Again, we're going to actually watch that extremely closely as we get into it. When we look at immigration itself, again, we just talked about the restaurant industry, the construction industry. What are your thoughts there that's going to happen? You've got, the numbers are all over the map. They've been talking about 7 million, 12 million, et cetera, et cetera. What's your gut feel at this point about what impacts it's going to have across the board?
We went through this in 2018 and 2019 with the remain in Mexico and the dampening of crossings of the border. What you saw was a higher labor participation rate because the wages, they went up, but you were getting people back into the labor force who might have been on the sidelines. As I recall, I think we were up at high 63% or something like that before COVID hit. And I would expect that to repeat. Again, in California, the minimum wage is dampening the demand for labor. It's going to bleed over into available hours, that sort of stuff. Technology's got a limited impact in there. And I think construction is going to be affected by interest rates for housing.
Yeah, there's definitely demand for construction, but I will be concerned about the level of deportation. So if it's to the level that the campaign talked about, it's not 2018, 2019, stay in Mexico. because it's people that are already here contributing to the economy. So if it's much smaller, then I agree that there will be some positive impact. But if you're trying to deport like 10 million people, there's costs involved in it, and there's impacts on local economies too.
And agriculture.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, the feedback we're getting from our construction members and the restaurant members, well, universally, of course, is they're concerned about it, because that's their ready source of labor. However, they've been through this before in decades past. So it is going to be a real concern, at least short term, about how it's going to be managed and how it's going to be rolled out, because again, it's not just the individuals that are not documented, but also family members and things of that nature that have been talked about. So we'll have to see how that's going to unfold. But certainly what we're hearing, it's going to be a major impact on the construction industry, both the commercial and retail, as well as the restaurant industry. And then to your point, Don, agriculture. So this is going to be, again, an unfolding situation. We're going to know sooner than later, apparently, exactly how broad and how deep this particular initiative, this drive is going to be. Just take you back. You've all seen this before. We've been here before. Reagan himself, that granted amnesty to 2.9 million people back in the 80s, because they had reached the conclusion that it just wasn't possible to identify that many people and then start a process of deporting them out of the country. Now, this is a different day and age, different political environment, different ideas about how to get it done. But again, this isn't anything new for any of us. We've been at this before. So again, we'll have to see about the depth and breadth of how fast and how deep this goes. Any other comments there?
I was wondering what the impact would be from a job perspective for all of those of us on this FENG call. And I thought of two things, and I'd love to get feedback from other members. One would be in the construction industry, for those of us who are looking in that industry as CFOs, what might be the impact if, will construction companies disappear if they can't find manual labor? I don't know. I'd be interested in other members' feedback on that. And then if immigrants seem to produce jobs at higher rates than native-born Americans, what does that mean for us as job seekers? And I'd be interested in any feedback from other participants.
Yeah, I think the deportation will primarily impact blue-collar workers. For most of us, I don't think we compete with them at all. So I think the deportation will have impact on business owners, but not so much to white-collar people like us. That's my 2 cents. Thanks.
I would agree. If you take a look at who's been coming through, we're not talking high-skilled people. They would come through legal channels. They have access to green cards, sponsorship, etc. And I think Stan's hit on a good point. You got, I think the numbers are 160 or 170 countries have had people coming through. Generally, we're not seeing high-skilled people coming that way.
Yeah, but I think John's point is that if the business is impacted by the blue collar folks coming, being hard to find, then the companies are going to have to consolidate. They're going to have to merge. They're going to close. And that's going to impact white collar workers that work there as well. So I think there's going to be unemployment impacts to white collar folks as well.
Or you do like what's happening in 2018 and 19, the wage rate goes up, the prevailing wage rate goes up, and you get higher participation.
Yeah, the wages will have to go up because there's a backlog too, because the high interest rates has prevented new construction from going full speed. So as interest rates drop, there will be more interest from developers to get their projects going. So there will be a pressure on wages, even if the immigration stays stable, because there will be more construction going on as interest rates come down.
Yeah, I think all of your inclination is correct. The other way that we view this is from an infrastructure standpoint. Both federal projects as well as the need for housing has still not gone away. It's still a huge delta in housing that needs to be built. That's got to be funded. That's got to be done by someone. So we want to look closely at infrastructure funding as we go into Q1, Q2 in particular. That's going to prop the industry up, but also create this demand. And I agree with all of your comments. No matter what happens, this is going to drive wages up in these sectors, particularly construction, retail, and commercial. That's the way we're seeing it. But again, there's going to be has to be some stimulus, particularly on the infrastructure side, as we move into it.
How much does regulation impact construction?
Well, if you look at the West in particular, from our standpoint, regulatory impacts are very significant in terms of getting projects approved, getting them green lighted, and then getting them off and running. If you look at the restaurant industry in particular, and some of these numbers are different by industry, restaurant segment, but if you're going to start, say, a franchise unit of a restaurant in the state of California, it takes roughly 4 times longer than in the state of Texas. As you go through land acquisition approvals of the construction itself, approvals of bringing the restaurant online. So it's roughly, the last numbers we looked at were somewhere around 4 to 5 months versus 1 month or 2 months in a place like Texas. So regulations, again, do tend to put a damper on this. We'll have to see, again, take a look at, particularly on the construction side, how that unfolds here early in the year. Obviously, some of the regulatory things in place are necessary from an environmental standpoint and other perspectives. But on the other hand, there's a lot of the paperwork that or rules and regulations that don't seem to need to be there. I'll give you just a couple of anecdotes here. When you've seen this before happen, particularly in federal highway construction, when there's been an emergency. A few years ago, there was a major artery that was shut down in the city of Atlanta, the 400 freeway, and it was the intersection of 400 and 85. The entire artery was shut down because of a fire. But because of incentives to construction companies, as well as the elimination and streamlining of permitting, they were able to do it in virtually 1/10 of the time it would normally have taken. So we know that there's built-in delays and waste as part of these regulations. It's just a question of how do you get to it and still maintain a safety net that needs to be there. Other comments on this?
Yeah, I know regulation around water is a concern too in areas like Arizona and Atlanta, Florida, like Georgia, Florida. There's states fighting for water rights. Colorado River also is a problem, right? So we have to see how the regulation plays with that, because it's already not enough water to begin with. So
this is a really interesting area, Scott, that you brought up. Do you think there'll be more regulation at the state level? Do you think states will become more important than the federal government, given what recently happened in the elections? That's what's coming out of PricewaterhouseCoopers when they did a study of CFOs. I'd be really interested in your perspective.
Well, just pointing out again, go back to the restaurant industry. It's already happened. As I mentioned, if you look at the restaurant example, say franchise restaurants, in the state of California, it's already happened in terms of the permitting process is much more onerous than in other states. And it will, in many cases, come down to a state-driven regulations that determine whether they're going to be, things are going to move faster or slower. And again, this is nothing new. This has always been that way.
Hey, Scott, if I can add in, John, a further thought. What would be the purpose of adding regulations? Okay. Is there a legitimate purpose, or is it being done for spite? Right. Is an open question. Further, there is an ancillary impact, and we've seen it post-COVID, where there's been an internal migration of states from high tax, high regulatory locations to lower tax, lower regulatory locations. Come 2030, with the census, you're already seeing California is projected to lose 4 congressional seats. That's a lot of loss of power. And if they don't realize from a self-preservation standpoint, you got to kind of temper that. They're going to lose power and influence. So, and lose citizens. It's already happened in California, the budget deficit, in large part to high income people fleeing the state. So, I hear your point. It has to be tempered with, there's going to be consequences that people need to be thoughtful about.
Is it more state or local? Which one is going to be the roadblock? Or are they
State.
both?
Well,
I think the state, Scott, because I don't think the agencies are at the state level, not the county level typically.
yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's going to be at the state level. Although I want to take you back to something, this goes back many years ago, and this was the war for heavy manufacturing and distribution in the Southeast. And what many localities in the Southeast, particularly in Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, created inventory exemptions, created training incentives, and also tax breaks for northern-based manufacturers to move to the South. And that was an extremely effective routine. Now, the South had to do that because the textile industry was decimated. But it was a very effective strategy. They actually came out of local municipalities. So again, that's be interesting to watch and see how that would go. But generally, it is a statewide driven regulatory environment.
If you look at housing, isn't it local regulations that can slow things down?
That's I don't know, others can chime in here, but it's generally, yeah, a combination of both. But you can have some fairly severe housing regulation. It's also that not in my neighborhood mentality too, that prevents builders from coming in certain neighborhoods. So again, all this plays into it. Bottom line, on the housing side, we're still in a major deficit. The estimates are, again, in the millions. I hear as low as 3 million up to as high as 12 million in terms of housing shortage. So I think there's going to be some bright spots there. There has to be. So let's keep moving on. The social cultural aspect of this. What do you see as the defining cultural shift or demographic shift as we look at 2025? For example, we've got 5 generations of people in the workforce now. And there's actually been an increase in 60+ workers. In fact, one of the fastest growing employment groups is people above 60 years old. I don't have the exact number, but it's a fairly significant increase. Now, not all those are full-time, some are part-time, but more businesses are starting to target that demographic in terms of creating opportunities for those you might typically think of as retired. But what are you hearing on this? And of course, you see the Social Security chart. We already know what's going to happen there in terms of the potential deficit by 2034. But let me get your feedback on that from a business and from an employment standpoint.
Well, I think I can speak to our company. We're kind of unique restaurant company. We've got we just had a manager retire in his 60s, but he'd been with us 45 years, something like that. We got another one who's going to his 50th, and he started when he was 16. He's going to hit his 50 years in a year. So I think we're going to see, the 60+ worker continue. There's another thing going on, and I don't know if people have read, but there's a dearth of births And it's not just the United States, it's global. So you're having a globally shrinking population. So that means at some point in time, the front end of the pipeline entering the workforce, and we're going to see it hit the schools probably in the next 5 years, is shrinking dramatically by millions of people. And that's a concern. I mean, there's some talk that Japan and Korea might not exist as countries in a couple generations. It's so slow.
Other thoughts?
They're still we're still dealing with ageism and the bias against older workers. And uh, even though, there's not enough younger people to take those positions, older workers have to stay in the workforce longer to make up for not having saved for retirement. I think there's a lot of things pushing older workers to stay in, and there's a lot of forces inside companies trying to push them out. So.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Definitely this chart that you're looking at is driving a lot of that thinking, both from the employee perspective, those that thought they were going to retire, but now have to get back into the workforce because of inflation and other impacts. That's there. Although we are hearing some bright spots from employers who recognize that there are some very smart and productive people in that category, the plus 60, and they're making accommodations for that worker. Also, what's helped us all is during the pandemic, the idea of remote work, the more effective use of remote work is starting to play into that. So we're seeing a lot of that shift. So with this chart, I would have to say it's actually, there are more bright spots to it than negative spots. Ageism is still there, obviously, but at the same time, we're hearing from a lot of employers that they have a demand for these type of experienced workers and they want them.
Hey, Scott, if I can give you an example of an extreme, there's a guy in our church who's still practicing law at age 90 on a remote contract basis.
Yeah, it's a great example. I can't tell you the number of stories I've heard of that. People well into their 80s, contributing, active, and really performing a tremendous service for their companies and communities. So I totally agree with you on that. So if we keep moving here, I want to be respectful of your time. The regulatory, we brought this up earlier. There was a lot of talk during the campaign about streamlining regulations, bringing in something of a productivity czar, whether that's Musk or whoever it is. But to look, and this is not the first time this has been brought up, streamlining government. But what do you expect? What are you hearing, or what do you expect to happen?
Well, there's already a congressional push to look at, the regulatory stuff regarding green energy mandates, EV mandates. I mean, the automotive guys are saying this EV mandate's ridiculous. It's unachievable. There's also some congressional ability to overrule, more recent regulations that have been put into place. So I think in the energy sector, environmental sector, stuff that's been overly onerous is going to be reduced dramatically.
Cutting the size of government will help reduce the amount of regulation.
Yeah, I think this is. Go ahead.
Yeah, for the deregulations, I think the hope is very high that the new administration will cut down red tapes and but dramatically. But I would caution that the on one hand, the administration probably will slim down some of the agencies, but at the same time, I think they probably will put up new ones. For example, to stem future illegal immigration, or tighten up export control to non-airline countries. So regulations probably come down on one hand and goes up on the other hand. So I in general, I still see a reduction in the government spending, but I think the trajectory is still to be, higher than previous year. So inflation plus, I still see that. There is a high hope because Elon Musk was mentioned to be hired as a new efficiency officer, something like that for the government. I just don't know what kind of role he will play in the government. That will be interesting to watch. If he's dedicated some real power to do that, that would be definitely more efficient government is expected. But a lot of the changes, I guess, will have to go through the Congress as well. So there's I don't know the latest count. Is a Republican controlling both houses or not?
Yeah.
I'm still not
Yeah.
clear.
Yeah, it's Republicans have got the sweep. So Stan,
And
there is a
I-
precedent for what you said was the base closings. They're all military bases. And so probably the approach that Musk, if he's empowered, will create a task force and he'll create a slate of recommendations, and it's basically take it or leave it. And the Congress then can say, well, it's not my fault, it's their fault. And that was what happened with the base closings. And so
Yeah.
that worked pretty well.
And to Stan's point, I think you hit on it exactly. The question that I have is, will these regulatory adjustments be, and Scott, I'd love your insight, will they be more talking points, or will they be actual, technical adjustments that will have an impact on our industries? And I think that will be a very interesting thing to watch.
Yeah, well, Dave brought up one of the bright spots and all that. That was the base closings. That's a good model to look at. Although we've kind of heard this approach to regulatory streamlining for many, many years, and it's a very difficult area to tackle. It's whack-a-mole, what it is. You can get rid of one regulation, another one pops up. 2 months ago, Gavin Newsom had 800 bills on his desk to sign. To go with or no go. I'm sure many of those 800 bills were very effective and going to be beneficial, but who knows? So it's this constant drive to prevent all these things coming up and really put a lens against them to say, is this going to be effective, or do we really need it? Or more importantly, what do we need to get rid of that's going to streamline business? I'm optimistic, but again, this is one of the tougher issues that we have to face going forward. Hopefully it's the 80-20 rule too, that we go after the big stuff first and see how we can move some mountains there. But keep an eye on this, particularly again, this is a Q1, Q2 thing to see where it's going to be moving. Let me just go into, see if I can get this to, there we go. The investment buyers, we'll just touch on this because we're getting close to the end of the time. Where do you see, we just had a 1/4 point rate decrease. Where do you see us by June 2025? What's the group consensus on this, if we can get a consensus?
Well, I think Mr. Powell is he's watching his back right now. And I think future interest rate increases will be tied to what's happening on the inflation front. So maybe another 25 to 50 basis points in the first half is probably the max I would expect.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Scott, we're going to have to see increases on the interest rate, because if the Feds want to borrow money from market participants in the bond market to finance their operations, the Feds are going to have to give a better interest rate than 4.5%. And Jerry Powell has to know this and is going to have to get in the ear of Donald Trump and say, look, buddy, you're going to have to pay up, or these market participants are not going to give you money.
You haven't brought up the federal deficit. And doesn't that going to impact this area?
The deficit comes into play. What's everybody's opinion on this?
It hasn't so far.
Not so far. There wasn't much discussion about it in the past.
No, because the Fed has been printing for the last 4 years. The Fed's been printing money. We've run $2 trillion deficits year in, year out post COVID, and it's been funded by Fed bond issuance. So if if they can restore some higher rates of economic growth, that'll mute the impact of the deficit.
But if people get concerned about the federal deficit, then are people going to buy the borrowings that are issued by Treasury?
I'm not sure where else they go around the world for better rates. Japan just had a hiccup on the carry trade earlier this year, and that was taking the interest rates up from 10 basis points to 25, if I'm not mistaken, something ridiculously low. So if you look around the world, where are you going to get a better return?
Yeah, I'd have to echo that too, Dave. The U.S. is the only shop in town, and this is the deficit is there. It's the elephant in the room that nobody's really addressing. And if you listen to some of the economists, they say this is what's going to crash everything. Keep an eye on it. We can't sustain this. On the other hand, we've kind of ignored it now for many years and continue to ignore it, even during the pandemic with that kind of spending.
Haven't we ignored fiscal responsibility? I bet everyone on this call that are running companies, they wouldn't run their companies like we're running our country.
Oh my
Richard?
God, Willard, you're so right.
That's because 2/3 of the federal budget is Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and that's the third rail. Nobody refuses to touch that. And if you take defense and interest costs, it leaves a very small sliver to debate. So unless you're going to touch the third rail, very little will be done.
Larry, that's a great point. And this third rail, that's going to be a can that keeps getting kicked down the road again and again. We don't see any real change there. There's been talk about it, but not any real change.
Yeah, and what I view is the funding of the wars since 1990. It's not just today's wars; it's going back to the Iraqi wars, the two there, but also funding the baby boomers. Right, everything's going to the baby boomers, not just the Social Security, Medicare, but it started, back in the 1960s, and just funding that generation, which the generation is pretty much fully able to retire at this point legally at 62. They're not quite at 65 to get on Medicare, but they're pretty darn close. I think that those that are able will retire, and as Dave said, he's got a couple employees that are, but those that are not 60 plus able to retire, they'll take the jobs they can. It could be, waiters, waitresses, other kind of light duty work, but those that are in heavier duty work probably won't have the ability to do that any longer, just physically. But they'll have to work in some capacity. It might be at, one of the big box hardware stores or something like that. But I think on the flip side, the immigration, that's been our growth engine in the United States for forever. And so if you slow that down, it actually slows down GDP, and it actually increases inflation because, as you said, the manual laborers won't be there for construction and farming. So I think with the interest rates next year, depending on tariffs, that could cut GDP significantly and also kill the job possibilities for many people.
That's a great point. And I, just to kind of summarize some of this, and again, Dave, Don, Joyce, this might be an interesting topic to come back to in the first quarter once we have let's see what the directions are going. Certainly at the E&P live event we're doing on February 27th, we're going to do a temperature check against all of these arenas we've been talking about, see what CEOs are expecting to happen and what is happening. The other one that we have to talk about, again, that's an impact. I'm just going to kind of go through this quickly because I know we're over time a bit. And that is the AI's impact on talent and employment. According to Mercer, over 80% are going to be 80% of jobs are going to be affected by generative AI. And virtually all the jobs are going to see the core task change. In fact, Mercer says that 19% of jobs will see 50% of their tasks affected over the next 2 years. Again, this is Mercer's study they just did just came out. So the AI is going to have a huge impact on employment. Here's the other thing about AI, and I just want to share this with you. Again, you'll get a copy of this deck. When employees were questioned about what keeps you from being most productive, because productivity came out as the #1 issue across our CEO survey this past year. That was the issue, productivity across organizations. And interesting, when we asked employees what keeps them from being productive was too much busy work, too many interruptions, particularly with the Zoom calls, workload that is too high or unsustainable. That was a common refrain across all sectors. Difficult finding the right information or experts or getting the right information. Inability to work when and where I work best. Again, you still got this tug of war between remote versus bringing people back in. And then being asked to learn new technologies, people still struggling with that. The biggest one at the bottom here, I buried the lead, lack of trust and autonomy to do my job. This trust and autonomy issue is huge. And that really came up in the forefront during the pandemic, where there was a lack of trust between employees and the company. You saw that in the form of petitions and strikes, or even strikes within non-union companies. So again, I thought this was interesting that these are issues that we need to deal with as we're going to increase, by leveraging AI, increase the productivity rates. Any comments on that before we move on? I'm sure all of you have seen this and kind of feeling it now. Again, this is going to be a huge wave that we see as integrate across organizations. So here's what we suggest to you. We've covered a lot of ground today. This is a lot of macro stuff. I think you should go back and take a look at it by arena and see how this is going to impact you from a personal and business standpoint. So if you haven't already mapped out a strategic plan for yourself for 2025 at a personal level, and then separately the business plan for your organization, now is the time to do that. Now, with an idea that you potentially will adjust and adapt as you go into Q1, Q2. So we're saying not necessarily is everything set in stone as you go into 2025, but at least you've laid out the key goals as you see them now for you personally and as a business. And I've said this time and again, we see only 2% of executives lay out a personal plan before the end of the year. That's been our surveyed result for the past decade. Only 2% actually write their goals down. But of those 2%, those are the ones that are most successful in getting things accomplished, getting things done, because they've got something measurable in front of them. They can go Q by Q, quarter by quarter, and say, yes, I've accomplished it. A couple of you already mentioned that you do this, and it helps keep you on track. So again, I can't encourage you enough, lay out those plans for 2025. We've got something called a 100-day plan I can send you if you like, that will help you map that out. Secondly, if you're inside a company, insist on getting a strategic offsite done with your leadership before the end of Q1, please. This is the time you want to regroup your team, set some goals for them across the board, make sure everybody's on the same page and alignment, make sure you've included everyone so that you get those contrarian views. Just like we've had the conversation today, you're going to pick up some contrarian views from your leadership team about where to go. So leadership offsite before the end of Q1, please. And again, this idea of measurable, adaptable goals as we go into 2025. One set of goals or one rigid set of goals would not apply necessarily in this environment. I got to look also as you're getting into 2025 is to execute. SpaceX is famous for this, not from a variety of reasons. Not only are they able to execute in terms of getting those rockets off, but also they've already thought through the reusability and sustainability of their rockets. You saw that fantastic recapture of the engine booster the other week. So they've done, but the key thing we like about SpaceX is their ability to execute, make mistakes, adapt, and keep coming back and trying over and over again. So again, we use that as a great example as we go forward. All right, finally, a couple of reads for you. This book just came out about 3 weeks ago by Seth Godin. It's a simple, quick read. It's got roughly 100 ideas for you to put together your strategy for 2025. It's on Amazon. It's a paperback and it's on Kindle, etc. I suggest you take a look at that. It's a fast read, may give you some ideas, both from a personal standpoint of your own employment thrust for 2025, as well as for your business. So again, this is just Google "this is strategy" on Amazon, and it'll pop back up. And then finally, thank you. Again, I encourage you to join us at one of our innovation summits. Again, the next one's at February 27th. If you'd like a copy of the 100-day launch plan, I've presented that plan to this group in particular in years past. You've said you'd like that. And then finally, we do, one of our core businesses is doing strategic offsites for companies. If we can help you in that standpoint, glad to do so.